What is going on, everybody? It is the Void Boys Free Cerveza Mañana with Big Signorelli, aka Master Signified Torso. We're back at it with another one. Today we're doing two chapters on this episode. The introduction to Freud's scientific writings, followed by the this what's the other one? The play of writings, or as I like to call it, kid and play of writings. So definitely have a banger for you. Definitely going to be very difficult. I'm going to say that right away because this is having to deal with a lot of Freud's early scientific writings with a lot of scientific jargon. So we're going to have to flush that out. Nick, you got anything to say before we jump into it?
It does get a little hairy here
Yeah.
with the jargon and the symbols, but we won't let that deter us. I think that we'll be able to sift through
Right.
some of the more jargon heavy parts of the the two chapters that we're dealing with, and grasp what the main argument is driving at,
Right.
and also hopefully relate it back to this sort of anatomical organicist exploration of Freud's thought that we're pursuing here, which is not at all irrelevant. Although I don't know that like understanding every component of it is essential to understanding the main thrust of the argument. I haven't read the scientific papers yet, so I can't say I've totally done my homework.
Right. And it's definitely very difficult, but I think one thing that it shows by reading these scientific writings alongside with what the commentary that Lacan is giving is that it isn't this reductive anatomical biologism that we're used to, you know, believing, but rather sort of using them as metaphors. And if he's falling back into any sort of scientific milieu back in the day, it's physics, because it's making a lot more sense now, like going back to when we were talking about beyond the pleasure principle, the whole notion of entropy, law of thermodynamics, energy and information. And so we see how this sort of like what seemed to be irrelevant, why he was bringing that up, ties into these two lectures in this seminar in relation to the scientific writings, beyond the pleasure principle, and the dream work, pretty much.
Right. So some of the scientific themes we're dealing with here are entropy, energy equivalency, metabolism, input, output, and in this approach,
Homeostasis as well, or equilibrium, as they'll say sometimes.
right? Yeah, homeostasis, man as the homeostat, I
Mm-hmm.
think is an interesting way he puts it. And the way that by approaching this from not an object relation point of view, but a critique of the object relationist point of view, we're able to track energy equivalences and ask ourselves in the midst of like autoerotism,
Right,
where
right,
do we
right.
get consciousness? How does consciousness emerge there?
Exactly.
What's the place of the ego within this very complex system of relations between organs and energy investments?
Mm-hmm. No, yeah, that's good to point it out, because that's something that's definitely different from like an object relation, is because it seems like the object has this sort of crude representation that you would see in, like, philosophy, in the subject and representation. And this is, I think, I guess jumping right into it, the whole problem that I guess Lacan has is the relationship between that and the sort of, I, I guess how you described it was energy equivalence, or not even that, just the fact of the entropy and energy and the need to discharge it, because there's no sort of relation between the sort of subject or the ego in object relations and the object of satisfaction. What exactly is satisfied by that object, right? And what is its relation to the libido? This gets fleshed out in this a little bit gets fleshed out in this chapter. But of course, he's going to have a big seminar 4, that's entirely dedicated to imminently critiquing object relations.
Right. And one of the challenges of object relations is it can't answer the question, as he puts it, of how something can be its own source of the source of satisfaction itself and the object of satisfaction. So you get this sort of Ouroboros in autoerotism. This is something he explores in Seminar 1 with, he's at pains to illustrate what exactly distinguishes Freud's idea of primary narcissism from a general object relationist theory of, well, maybe like what Ballant calls primary love, for instance. And it's like this primary narcissism, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think it has to do with, in that famous chapter we read on Verneinung with Hippolyte, the way the initial ego, I think what he calls pleasure ego at one point, is formed through this series of layerings of affirmations and negations, in a sense. And there's a primary narcissism that emerges through that process.
And one thing I think that gets kind of fleshed out too with the entire optical schema, which he does reference, if not in this chapter, I think it's the next one, in relation to the scientific writings, is that like the notion of a primary narcissism doesn't exist on its own, because it's like once we're thrown in a world of language and with others in this symbolic order in which there's secondary narcissism right away. Like the primary narcissism seems to be something that is always retroactive. Because even in sort of like within object relations, it's always this, like, again, back to the primary love of Ballant, the baby in relation to the mother's love, which is supposed to be the object. But how is that love or object supposed to be in relation, like necessary, or what makes that a necessary relation, if not for the sort of mapping of the body with polymorphous perversity, if I'm not mistaken, if that's like, I think that's what Lacan is trying to get at when it comes to Freud, and kind of rethinking polymorphous perversity. But the object and the sort of recognition that symbolizes the mother's love in relation to the child's desire or demand for the love, demand for the breast, or whatever term object relations wants to use.
Right. So would you say that this demand, as it emerges, is sort of like the margin of need, is leads to a symbolic dynamic with the mother,
in
some sense. So you get the beginning of the symbolic from the very start. I think that's what Lacan wants to show us with the optical schema, is how the symbol is there from the very start. And in order to really conceive of the libido in a way that gets beyond the limitations of object relations theory, we need to also understand it in its symbolic valence, in a sense.
And something I think that with primary narcissism, this imago that is a sort of identification with one's body, ultimately leads to like gaps and failures, because of course it lacks a symbolic order to sort of situate it in a sort of secondary identification. What you have is this sort of frustration. And if you look at it, I've been thinking about this. If we look back at the wolf child, right, he's always going through a series of certain primary identifications with his body every time he looks in the mirror, and it becomes very destructive, and he acts out a bunch of aggressivities and even aggressive patterns, attacking his own image as if it's harmful and trying to identify with it. This
Right.
is yeah, and this is the problem of not only like primary narcissism on its own, but it shows the effects of how this sort of primary identification affects psychotics, or he was deemed psychotic, but later, like somebody like Leon Brenner would say he's autistic, but these sort of problem of mirroring for a primary identification, in which we'll talk about right here. It's not necessarily this instinctual relationship between an object, but as we were saying, this ouroboros of the body taken as the object of satisfaction.
Which is tantamount to taking the image, wouldn't you say, as an object of satisfaction, and that it needs to be mapped via an image, and that leads to a kind of disequilibrium in the investments
Right, because
of different parts of the body as that mapping takes place, which, as we know, the mapping can only be affected through the symbolic intervention of, let's say, like the mother. And by mother, we don't necessarily mean a real biological mother, but a maternal figure of any kind, could be a man,
right,
that yeah, it they mediate the process of identification. So there's a sense of almost like validation that goes into this sense of mapping the body. And I think that this is relevant to today's debates about body positivity and whatnot, which is like, sure, you should embrace the body that quote unquote God gave you in
right,
a sense, or you could go in the opposite direction and completely refashion your body through exercise or even certain chemical solutions. But it's like, whatever the case is, you're always constantly mapping and remapping your body, and there is a kind of a social sanctioning that takes place in that process. I would say
a
there
lot
is the
of
gaze of the other that
yes,
is present there.
yeah, and it's the law, and it has to do with the law of like that's internalized. We could call it the superego, which brings again a certain sense of sanctions of enjoyment and prohibitions of what you prohibit as far as what can be enjoyed, and then what is not allowed in the social order or the symbolic order. One thing to point out is like what you're saying, like when we talk about the mother, it doesn't have to be one's biological mother, or talking about the father, the paternal function, the paternal metaphor. It has nothing to do with the literal biological father. And I think that's what object relations gets wrong, because even if they say, well, yeah, I agree, it doesn't have to be a mom or dad, literally. What they get wrong is the sort of fact that like it always falls back to this imaginary relationship between two bodies, and that the term mother function or father function are nothing but signifiers that sort of relate or enter in a circuit of communication and language and feedback for the symbol of the child. Does that kind of make sense?
Yeah, language is contingently hooked
Yeah.
on the symbolic function
Yes, because
of that person who is thought to be its source
yeah.
in some sense. I think that's what I get from that. But let's jump into this part
Yes.
here, because I really like this. This is a great passage, really eye-opening, from Freud's instincts and their vicissitudes. And it is a wonderfully concise description of and simultaneously critique of the scientific method. Now, Freud is not rejecting the scientific method here as completely like without application or importance, but he's pointing out how the role of, let's say, he says convention, we could also say naming, is determinative in this process, in as much as like the conventions that are applied to the empirical data, the observations made, the data that's drawn therefrom, has at first an almost like kind of arbitrary uh placement upon that information, but then as it emerges as information in a sense, it does come to determine the further conclusions that are made about the empirical observations in a way that actually results in determining what comes of the material observed. So it becomes the destiny of what's observed in a sense, even though initially the conventions are just conventions. I don't know if that made any sense.
Oh
It's a
yeah,
little roundabout, but
and over ultimately, like what are you saying is like, because when you read instincts and the vicissitudes, the thing that's put into question is the notion of instinct. The essay, I think, on the footnote of this chapter says, what is it? Drives in their destiny, not on the other one. Yeah, it's on the second page where he says that drives in their destiny is a more accurate translation. But needless to say, it's the one thing that he's questioning is the fact that instinct isn't something that was, sort of discovered through description and observation, but actually is the sort of arbitrary, unclear, and abstract concept that then gets posited and then framed on the model of science while it's using sort of empirical observational data, and then tries to sort of uh, validate it through other means. But for some reason, with how much progress and gathering of the amount of information for a sort of deduction or induction, certain terms are a sort of kind of swept under the rug. It's like the sort of elephant in the room that's never really addressed. And for him, it's instinct. And so he really much like you were saying, like ultimately he pretty much is saying it's like we need to realize that not all science is pretty much textbook accurate with every term, and we need to put this term into question, and therefore this is going to be the trajectory of what I want to talk about when I look at not only instincts but drives and its relation to instinct, and how we're the only animal that pretty much, if we call ourselves an animal, don't rely on instinct but actually are moved by drives.
well, if I could break in here, what he says here though, um, before we get to the question of drives, because that is really interesting. And I remember for very first episode we had when we were going over the commentary on seminars 1 and 2, Malaire said it's actually object A that ultimately links language and drives in a sense, which I find really fascinating. But here we have a statement Freud makes that everything that happens in the nature of these conventions depends on their not being arbitrarily chosen, but having significant relations to the empirical material. I think what Lacan is going to try to underline is that it's not even so much the relations to the empirical material initially, because again, we can't just call everything. Well, we can look at scientific observations and we can choose names of our own preference to describe those, but those names themselves need to have interrelations in the
Yes.
way they work. And then somehow what happens is the empirical material to which they're applied comes to conform, in a sense, to the interrelations of the
Right.
symbols being deployed. And that the deployment of these symbols obeys a certain logic of its own.
Yeah.
And that ultimately the logic can't fully be separated from the empirical material, but then the empirical material, of course, conditions the
Right.
logic of the signifiers.
Right. And the main thing I want to like be like a little philosophical about is the fact that the difference between the empirical and the sort of observational is that the empirical is sort of like the gathering of data that you get from observation. You try to create a sort of model of reality that's supposed to be independent from human observation. Like this is how reality would be, without the sort
Yeah, I
of
mix those two terms together, right? There's a separation there, right? You have the
but it would still
empirical
conform
model.
to a logic though. You're still right, yes, but like the empirical is a sort of conforming of the sort of observation of the uh natural world. But like you
Right.
said, it's the logic and then sort of these symbols that are abstract that sort of have this interrelationship between the empirical kind of conditions and conforms, and it sort of kind of piggybacks off that and justifies the abstract term, validates it. It gives it life.
Right. So the empirical is the model that we build based on
Mm-hmm.
observations
Mm-hmm.
that lend themselves to quantification theoretically.
Yeah, exactly. Especially for science.
And like you were saying before, the model par excellence for science at this time is physics,
Exactly.
basically. So, but like you're saying, right? So the he quotes this passage to draw attention to this word instinct, and well, it's as a mistranslation, right? I mean, here he's saying it's the invention of this woman, Madame Anne Berman, but I thought of it as like Strachey's mistranslation.
Right, but I think like that thing has to do with the I guess like a French translator. But yeah, it would be the same thing with the way like Strachey translated into English. Because Strachey was British, right?
What?
Strachey was British, if I'm not mistaken, right?
I think so. If
Yeah.
anyone knows, they can tell us.
But no, yeah. And like what they say right here, that it should be called like propulsion, which drive would kind of be synonymous with something that just like propels and has like propulsion
Right. So, or like pulsation, I think of it
or
too,
pulsation.
something like compulsion,
Yeah.
pulsation, the pulse,
Yeah.
throbbing, you
Yeah.
know?
Yeah.
Um, the what were you saying before though? How does this attitude towards the scientific method apply to Freud in his discovery of the drive? Or let's say if there is a kind of transition from a concept of instinct to the drive, how does it illustrate the logic that he unfolds here?
Right. So like this is pretty much before uh beyond the pleasure principle, but in understanding like ourselves as sort of homeostatic, you know, beings, the pleasure principle and entropy seem to constantly be at odds with ourselves. And I guess for lack of a better term, what he's seeing using sort of speculation and while being committed to a sort of scientific rigor, like showing that this is again pre beyond the pleasure principle, but that there's a sort of like level of excess in our sort of striving for the object of quote unquote instinct, which of course is going to be object of desire or drive. And now I don't mean object of desire like objet, but uh, just in sort of the Freudian model. Um, and quite frankly, this is like going to be a build up to the theory of sexuality and sort of the essay on narcissism, but kind of going back to the whole thing about three essays of sexuality. this is like a sort of instinct that's put into question for us because they would say like, oh, our instincts is food, shelter, and then sex for reproduction. But as we know now, or like as common sense, it's like we don't have sex as an instinct for reproduction, but there are plenty of things that are mainly for pleasure and satisfaction, or to use Freud's terms, to the discharge of sort of this entropy or energy, to maintain homeostasis. But the way that we do it in a sort of excess kind of is counterintuitive for this sort of instinct where it's like, you only do it out of satisfaction. Like for an animal, like they eat and then once they're full, they're done, right? But when you think about like a sort of like symbolic order or sort of way that domesticates us, there's always this level of excess.
It's like you can't really test what someone's boundaries are socially unless you cross
Right.
them. I'm not
Right.
saying that's a good method, but
Yeah.
some people operate that way. But
Right.
what about, though, this idea of a scientific theory and one that in some ways talk about excess? It's like when a new concept is conceptualized, when one has a certain apparatus or technique that they apply to their empirical model that exceeds what the model can allow for,
Mm-hmm.
then it's like we need to adjust that framework in some sense. And that's what happens. And this is what the great merit of Freud consists in, is his ability to abandon a certain framework in favor of sticking to a rationale
Yes.
which exceeds that framework in a sense. And that's what he was led to do by the drive, that he could not help but succumb to the the temptation to destroy this framework so that he could get at the drive.
Right.
And it's like that is why Freud is scientific, I think, is what Lacan is saying.
Exactly. Sticking to something that's more rational to, the limitations of scientific method and observation in the sort of physiology and biology. And of course, he's talking about the human organism, but it made more sense and rationally speaking, to use terms like energy in the physics way because there is an excess of energy due to entropy, right? And energy in the law of thermodynamics like doesn't die, right? It's always existing, but there's like this need to discharge, and to find sort of equilibrium. And so that's why he adopts that sort of appropriates it in a rational way to create this model of understanding for the human organism in a sort of scientific, and that's why he calls it a scientific psychology, because the psychology back in this day was resorted to sort of like biologism, which is kind of ironic because we would call Freud a biologist, and even the way you learn Freud, it's like, oh yeah, the father of psychology. No, he wasn't. He was the father of psychoanalysis. The father of psychology was Wilhelm Wundt.
And I think what's also at play here is a kind of misrecognition,
Yeah.
where it's like instinct is the misrecognized form of drive, but it's only through his pursuit of this concept of instinct that he's able to get at what exceeds the limitations of this concept of
Mm-hmm.
instinct. And then we get to drive. So
Mm-hmm.
let's talk about psychosomatic problems, object relations, and our boy, Dr. Perrier,
Perrier.
gets a lot of flack here. He's one of our little idolaters, I think,
Right,
in
right.
many ways.
Yeah, and it's sort of creating these like weird like psychosomatic models. Yeah, because the question is this the narcissistic relation of the ego um to the sort of organs, which again I think with the object relationists they fall into this like notion of yeah, they're gonna talk about narcissism in the clinic. They talk about splitting of the ego, but again they don't have the notion of drives in the sense that Freud and Lacan are dealing with. Um, and in sense of like, to them, there's still instinct, but with again, what we're kind of reiterating and being like a dead horse is the excess and repetition of drives that's at play, and how this predominance of narcissism is the sort of, well, I wouldn't say it's just necessarily a drive. I know, like, during this time of Freud, he distinguishes between libido drives and ego drives, which we've talked about as far as being kind of sort of contradictory in the early chapters of this entire seminar, which I think end up getting kind of uh, thrown out for the death drive as being like the one drive for Lacan.
Hmm.
Because I mean, if there is libido drive and their ego drive, well, the ego and narcissism are sort of libidinal investment of the image, right? And so to tie that into what's going on right here, I think what Lacan wants to know is the relationship between these sort of organ relations and psychosomatic model with narcissism. Because when we talk about psychosomatic symptoms, and especially like a neurotic, it has nothing to really do with the sort of internal relation of organs, but rather the narcissistic image of the organs as my organs and the way I sort of obsess over them and like the symptoms that I have. Does that make sense?
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely.
And what he's saying is like, if there are these relationships of organs and the narcissism and the way you internalize it, we should start with the fact that the I is that relation, especially when we look at the again, optical schema model. We're not just the I, right? It's a relation to the body and other sets of various organs. And again, not an abstract I, and not in the sense that, like, yeah, like it's a relation with the body and identification with one's own body, but we're also talking about if that I in that model is a neurotic or a hysteric, and how that I, which represents a symbol of ego or narcissism, and its relation with the M Imwell or Umwell, and its Inwell has a sort of misrecognition of their body, and this misrecognition that obsess over it, and then they have certain symptoms that further elaborate that misrecognition and what they're so certain or uncertain about. Does that make sense?
You mean there's like an overinvestment in certain organs, let's
Right.
say in object relationist terms, it would be, oh, well, this is happening objectively within the
Yeah.
body. Whereas I think what you're getting at is Lacan is saying that, well, first, if the symptom is a sort of message and the symptom is often physically manifested, then it's like in mapping one's body, creating an image of it, there are certain symbolic coordinates at play there, which need to be interpreted as symbols and therefore as signifiers. This is Lacan trying to um, linguistically understand or signifierize
Right.
the body in some sense, which is what has already happened. The emergence of the subject occurs through this sort of like signification of the body. And I think maybe we could think of psychoanalysis as an attempt to re-signify the body in some sense.
Yeah, and it's
Would you agree with that?
I would, and especially it made me think of in the first seminar in what is it, Zeitlich
You
Lungeschichte.
nailed it the other day with
Yeah,
Fleecefighter.
yeah, I did.
I was like, damn. Everyone was like,
This dude was spitting, but he says, well, Hippolyte's in the argument with him. It's like, and I think I might have said that in the flea spitter discussion, but he's like, yeah, there's two bodies. We have, the body of narcissism, or like the specular body, and then you have the body itself. He's like, no, there's only one body, and then that's what's, pretty much an argument here too, especially with somebody like Perrier, this elaborate sort of, and again, we'll kind of understand this more in the second chapter that we're going over, the play of writings, the sort of the internal system of psi, but that would still indicate a sort of model of like the internal body in itself and its reaction to the external world and its information that it brings in. But rather, there's always, of course, the buffer zone, which is ego and the consciousness. That what structures anything of a body or the world is always going to be the narcissistic relationship that you have of it. And again, later Lacan would say that there's no such thing in the body, but only jouissance of the body.
Right. So why does he criticize Perrier here in his attempt to distinguish between what psychosomatic phenomena at the neurotic level and then at the level of, well, the real comes in very
Right. Because
strikingly at this point.
he thinks that there's a sort of separate phenomenon different from the sort of neurotic phenomenon that is a sort of narcissistic investment. And what psychoanalysis is in the business of is not psychosomatic phenomenon, because you would have to distinguish that from phenomenon that isn't psychosomatic, I think. But mainly psychoanalysis is in the business of the psychosomatic phenomenon that is in relation to how the narcissist views it as such, and to think that there are psychosomatic phenomenon different from the narcissistic investment in it is a sort of, I think, error.
Right, because reality itself is a sort of psychosomatic phenomenon for
Right.
psychoanalysis, I would say,
Right.
in the
And
sense that it's always like hinges on a specific contingent relationship to a contingent object, which is the body.
right. And if you look at like again in the for they know not what they do in the Hegel's hysteric theater, he mentions this exact thing in here where he talks about like the sort of conversions are pretty much symptoms that can't be symbolized by, I guess, consciousness or language. So then they show up unsignified at the level of the real, but manifest as sort of psychosomatic phenomenon. Symptoms that come up with the body that can't. It's pretty much that excess that can't be symbolized, that resists symbolization, ends up showing up on the imaginary level of the body and how one identifies with their body. I think that's what I'm kind of getting at, like, or what I'm trying to, structure.
But what is the body here? Is it literally our limbs, our organs? Is it what we experience psychosomatically in terms of pains, sensations, pleasures that
it's gonna be all that. It's gonna be like hallucinations, seizures, dizziness, all these things. Other sorts of hallucination. It could constantly be the fact that's like with a hysteric, like they're always getting sick, like they're getting the cold, they're always coughing, they're always bedridden, but they can never understand why. Like, I was just sick like 2 weeks ago, and then like, I woke up with headaches after that, and then now I'm sick again, and then like kind of like a hypochondriac, pretty much like diagnosing themselves, obsessed about it, wondering why. No doctor could tell me why. I'm taking like, I don't know, Benadryl. This is an example of this manifestation of psychosomatic symptoms for the body. But again, there's this narcissistic relation to it in the way that we identify as like the sick body.
it's a relation to something which always lies on the edge,
Right, because it
of
has
our
to do with
conceptual
symptom.
elaborations. What do you think about that?
Say that again.
Where he says it's a relation to something which always lies on the edge of our conceptual elaborations.
Right, which would be like sort of the getting closer to the real, or like what the symptom is, like the jouissance or the drive, right? Because that for an obsessional or a neurotic, because ultimately we're dealing with neurotics right here. In this model, these sort of symptoms happen for a neurotic, and they the sort of cause or the symptom par excellence lies at that level where we fail to conceptualize, where speech fails, where language fails.
And what emerges is a kind of jouissance.
Yeah.
which is even these symptoms that we're talking about. Um, let's say a hypochondriac,
Yeah.
someone who's getting a cold every other week, even that could be considered a kind of manifestation of jouissance, would you say, or is that going too far?
It would be a manifestation of, yeah, like the symptom, like of the neurotic structure, which pretty much that which, because again, going back to the whole hysteric theater from Zizek, what he's saying is that these things that can't be, as far as like the neurotic structure and their speech, that which can't be put into language or like captured, like parts of the desire or whatever, the unconscious that fail symbolization end up showing up as bodily symptoms that have no sort of physical cause to them. They fail sort of the model of science as well, so they fail speech in that sense, and but at the same time they always leave a sort of trace.
So it's not just what imposes itself on the body from without, but almost the trace of the attempt to symbolize
Yeah.
something. And I guess we could think of it as like the first thing we symbolize via the imago is the body, and then everything else by extension. That's why the body is so important here.
Right.
Even if we can say, well, I'm just one body among many objects, it's kind of like why the whole idea that we're just all stardust and we're so minuscule in the universe is
right.
it is expressive of a kind of narcissism.
It really
in
is.
that it represses the fact that the body is always our frame of reference for everything, even our supposed littleness. It's like we're vastly more little than anything else in many ways, and that makes us special, and that we're so not special. But that's a little bit of a tangent here. But all right, so we were talking about this a little bit during the weekend with like voyeurism, exhibitionism. I like what he has to say about the eye and the way that this sort of Platonic understanding of the faculty and its object, which I think this understanding persisted well into certain domains of even like modern philosophy, I would say, even if it isn't explicitly stated this way, that the faculty, our faculties of judgment, for example, have to, in their structure, bear some resemblance to the object that they encounter, like as if, like must encounter like in its form. Like there's like an ontological relationship between what apprehends and what's apprehended here. And he says a little bit later, I think of something and then my mind incurves. He wants to demonstrate here how that is not how, at least the register of the ego, let's say, and consciousness in Freud's terms understands the object. It's always the refinding of an object. So remember during the reading group talk, we was it Fleisfader, I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing his name, but who mentioned Zizek's joke about the guy scrambling around looking for it to prove that he's unfit, like mentally, to be in the army, wants to get discharged on that basis, and he's like running around saying this isn't it, this isn't it, this isn't it, until someone writes him a doctor's note that says that he doesn't have to be in the service anymore. And then it's like he's like, oh, that's it. So he generates the object through this frenzied search for something that doesn't exist prior to the search. It has no object, but it's met with an object ultimately at the end. Now, that is how the formation of any object, or maybe we could even say how the symbol operates for Lacan in relation to the subject, who's always trying to re-find a lost object and producing new objects in the process. The problem with that is that means that all objects in the subject's entire universe, in a sense, is inflected by a certain series of I don't affective episodes that are definitive of that person's life, a historicization maybe, so that no object is truly neutral. It's never just an object. Its importance, its significance in the life of the subject is always determined by past encounters and failed encounters.
Right. And that's the whole point of the whole thing with Freud's, his theories of sexuality, is that an object is always a refining of an object because of failure, of failed attempts. And this is why, and I think you could probably connect it with what Valabrega is saying right here on this page, is that the reference to narcissism is essential. Narcissism does, however, lead to an object relation, but not like object relations in the way that a relationist would talk about. It's with the body itself as the only object to refine. Because anything out there is an extension of the body, a symbol that would represent a sort of mapping of jouissance or enjoyment or satisfaction via the primary narcissism. And to even project a sort of narcissistic enjoyment out there to a symbol leads to secondary narcissism, i.e., the ego ideal. Would you not say?
Right, right. Yeah, because what is the ego ideal but the ideal ego that is mediated by what conventions of what is socially acceptable.
Right. Or just the anticipation of how I would see myself in the future, with others. But yeah, what is
But it
conventional?
involves that. Yeah, no, that I love. We talk often about that anticipatory dimension, but it's that the signifier of oneself gradually coming into view. And I think that's where ideology becomes decisive here, in that it's like there's that intervention of the the gaze of others in some sense. I
Mm-hmm.
don't know if you wanted to take it there, or if, I mean, the
Right.
other is obviously important here.
Yeah. And so far as like, there's still like the internalization of the sort of law, right, being an instrument of enjoyment. And that if the eye is involved, the organ of the body needs the extension of the sort of other of doing harm or being harmed in the sort of sadomasochistic relationship of the need to harm others or the need to feel punished. And
Mm.
usually punishment is something of sort of a cruel jouissance onto the body, right? To be whipped, to be imprisoned, to be captured, any type of symbolized bodily harm or actual infliction of the body. But still, it has a sort of it is a masochism because it's sort of this enjoyment to be watched or to be seen while it's being done.
Yeah. Wow. It's like with sadomasochism. I mean, we know jouissance is essentially sadomasochistic. Both, I don't think anyone's purely sadistic, purely masochistic either. The idea of it being constitutive of our entire libidinal economy, in a sense, is we can bring master slave dialectic in there where, we have to be the master and slave to ourselves in order to symbolically situate ourselves within a world of our own creation, of course, is what he's saying. And in order to do that, it's as if, we need to see ourselves from outside of ourselves. And to achieve that means to take the position of the arbiter of the law itself, in some sense, in relation to one's body. So the idea of language itself being traumatic or traumatizing is one of like, well, the body doesn't fully pre-exist language in that sense, and there's no way to really develop a relationship with one's body that doesn't involve ideals of what is socially acceptable and what isn't. And there's no clear way to understand that but through the intervention of others, figures of authority. And therefore, hence the whole Freudian idea of like your entire libidinal economy, all of your sexual preferences in some ways being informed by figures of authority, figures
Right.
of love, figures of hate, figures of domination or submission. Like
Right.
all of these different elements go into the recipe of how you see your body and by extension, how you view the world, even in terms of like what you think of as right or wrong, acceptable, reprehensible. All of it ultimately rests on your relationship with your body, but also the relationship you have with your own desire, which
Hmm.
is determined by language. And the neurotic is that person who is most common in society because they can never comfortably, securely accept their own desire, but it must be displaced onto other objects. It must be kept at bay. It must be, um, indulged in at points, but then thrown away at other points. There's a very specific logic or strategy of evasion that is
Right.
pursued by the neurotic based on what they perceive of, I would say, as again, socially acceptable.
Right. And it goes back to what Zizek says in For the Know Not to Do is like, if God, if God doesn't exist, then there like nothing, there's no permission. It's only if God exists that all is permitted because God is the big other. And like with Christianity, I think what Hegel says what makes subjectivity or spirit different in the sort of Judeo-Christian religion uh, is the fact that God has this interpersonal relationship with you, so therefore you can always find this enjoyment with identification with the big other, which just kind of leads to a sort of weird perversion or even psychosis when we talk about like sort of the speculation of mystical states, right? And where you kind of become one with God. But I think it's kind of fascinating to show like this is like what you're saying is like you need others to have sort of enjoyment, and the neurotics can't seem to sort of fit themselves in a way to enjoy, or they can't even have enjoyment of their body without feeling guilt. And with the hysteric, it's sort of even failed, um, you know, interpolation with the sort of uh, ideology or symbolic order in general, and that's why there is a sort of subjectivity outside the structurations of the symbolic, which I think Lacan is ultimately trying to show, and people like Zizek and Madame Delar shows that there is a subjectivity outside the elementary structures in what structuralism tries to show. Like somebody like Althusser, right? We're subjects by interpolation. When the cop says, "Hey, you're a subject," but law fails, structure fails. We see that, and it's in the impasses of traversing the fantasy is where the subject is trying to work through in desire and fantasy. But what I wanted to get at is in this level of perversion and sadomasochism. It's like if you look at like for instance, and I got this from Perverse Capital. I forget the name of the author, but it's an episode from Machine Conscious. If we see again like enjoyment of the symbol or these things in the outer world as sort of this connection with the body, then even our money and currency in general, like our extensions that we used to exchange to get some type of libidinal enjoyment from the commodity, even if, like, as you were like speculating like in our side conversations, that the sort of commodity has a sort of neurotic structure, but capital has a sort of perverse structure in society itself. There's a sort of like sadomasochism, and like, you know that you need to pay the bills, you know that you don't have money, but hey, these ads say enjoy Black Friday, go ahead and shop for all these new deals, and you're like, I'm gonna buy this TV anywhere, these new shoes, even though I know I won't have enough to pay the rent, and you do it anyway, and you feel so punished by it. It's like, you feel so like hurt, but you enjoy that. You knew the consequences and you still did it. There's a sort of perverse masochistic enjoyment of knowing that like an extension of yourself will be hurt because you consumed and enjoyed something that the other allowed you to, or gave you that permission you should enjoy.
Well, don't you think that has to do with an almost like infantile process of trying to understand what the limits of the body are and the limitations of reality itself in respect to that? It's only through kind of repetition and punishment,
Right.
oftentimes, that we figure out, still into adulthood, for our entire lives, what we can and can't do in a given situation.
Right. A perfect example is the joke that Lacan says, only by being punished do you learn, but it's like you never, learn the next time you do it. You learn something, or you learn something different, but you still get punished.
Every time in a new way,
Yeah.
that's learning. So I like what he says here about reciprocal holism, taking an Umwelt. This is what we were talking about before, to correspond to an Innenwelt is a petitio principii, which is like a begging the question, right? Like
Right.
assumes the virtue of its own principles in a sense, or it's already contained. The subject's already contained in the predicate, vice versa. So we don't get anywhere. But this is that pre-established harmony that he wants to undo.
Yeah, this is like something that, like, again, is like what you kind of see in the sort of like vitalist theories also going around today, and like Freud being charged with the sort of vitalism with these writings. It's like, no, he's not talking about like some harmonious energy, like a sort of like, the God in Spinoza, this pantheism, or like something like Bergson and like the French vitalists that were going around during that day. Nothing like animism, or a soul that's imbued within everything. This is something totally different.
And he talks about the real a little bit here. He says the real is without fissure, which I think might be the second most important aphoristic statement he makes about the real, after the real is that which resists symbolization absolutely. This is the next sort of lapidary description of the real that he has, which is without fissure.
Right. Yeah.
Do you think a later Lacan would agree with that statement? Because it is the fissure in a sense.
Right. Yeah. That's what I would assume. And again, it begs the question if at some points the real is reality as it is, and where the reality or the human reality fails, right? And resist symbolization, the breakdown of the symbolic order, and it's there where the subject, of enunciation is kind of coming about, these deadlocks. So it's a good question. I would think, yeah. I think Lacan does change it.
Because it's like, although maybe not, on the other hand, the real has a kind of sameness for him, I think, even later in his career, real as sameness, which I'm just bringing this up as a little tangent because I'm doing my summaries of the chapters of surplus enjoyment, and Zizek says that his parallax real actually goes a little bit further than Lacan's conception of the real. The real is without a fissure, almost to me implies that it has a kind of substantial reality. I think Lacan, from the start to the finish of his career, believes that it is only via the symbolic that we really encounter the real. It's only the twist in the
Right.
symbolic, but
Right.
it being itself without fissure, I'm not so sure, because it seems like the real is the fissure in language itself.
Yeah, because if you look at the imaginary and the real on its own, like as far as like for like psychosis, it's more of like the imaginary giving a confused spectacle of the real.
Although, if you think about psychosis, it's as if in psychosis, the subject, the psychotic subject, is attempting to make a fissure in a real which is all too present
Right.
and undivided, and that
Mhm.
the language, not games, but like the attempt to sort of manage intractable signifiers on the part of the psychotic subject, who doesn't know signifiers as such in the way a neurotic subject does. It is trying to divide up parts of the real that resist division
Right.
in a
Right.
sense. But that's a digression. My great friend Hippolyte isn't here today because he's in Germany. Lacan, I feel like he's just like always shitting on his interlocutors and accusing them of not reading enough, basically, and like not reading Freud closely enough, or at least
Yeah.
not as closely as him, because he's like, I think he is at least as busy as most of you, which is ironic, I think, in tone. So it's time to think of reading.
It's just those sneak disses.
Yeah, the lack of respect for.
Yeah.
I think he respects his audience, but there's no one Lacan respects more than Freud, and then second to Freud himself, I would say.
Well, not the next chapter, but the one after that, which is I think it's what from Entwurf to the dream work. He gives another sneak diss to Leclerc, which is so funny. And it's like something that was like, someone like Valabrega, was good enough to schematize something right here, which even on a good day, Leclerc would do.
Yeah. He says something about like him wanting to represent the subject everywhere.
Yeah.
So yeah, he either openly or sneak disses everybody around him, but it's a way of like hystericizing. I feel like his
Right.
interlocutors are just like destabilizing them.
Right, right.
Um, so can we talk about the recording machine? Because this is something that I always struggle with, is when he talks about recording machines, cameras, stuff like that, in relation to the question of consciousness, symbolic exchange. He says with recording machines, we can isolate and preserve speech as it seems to be a self subsistent reality outside of our manipulation of it, our usage of it. Like we can see how it exists on its own through the
Right,
recording
yeah.
machine.
Yeah, like it exists outside of
But he
speech.
says the same thing about consciousness and the camera, in a sense.
Yeah. And the way that if consciousness, not in like the substantial sense, but having to do with an image, our subjective phenomenon can have a sort of uh life of its own and an objective function due to the symbolic order and what language, and even like I would say that things like the sciences and philosophy are in the realm of the imaginary, right? They have to do with understanding our image and place in the world, but of course we still need language for that, right? And with these different machines, they allow us to sort of further objectify and appropriate. I think we could even say the same thing in Marx, where we talk about need and labor, right, and work sort of being appropriated into different forms, to where these things take a life of their own, to where I guess now there's not this like pure survival, but sort of maintaining this life of its own, and the way that consciousness changes because of these different modes of productions that sort of have more agency than us. I think consciousness sort of, it doesn't take a life on its own, I should say language does, but how language, speech, due to the recording machine, takes a life on its own, and the way it's preserved, and even the image of that consciousness is does because of the recording machine or the camera, right? And even now with Instagram and how the privileging of pictures and stuff, all these things sort of not only objectify consciousness but also alienate it further. But it's overall not just something that is in the crude philosophical sense, like something located in the mind, or like a the what is it called? I forget the name of this analytical philosopher, but he has a critique of neuroscience and calls it neuromania because of this presupposition of consciousness being located in the brain, right? It's not local, right? The phenomenon of consciousness is not local. And I think Lacan is trying to show that in this materiality. When we try to bring this in the clinical sense, there's a sort of recording machine or camera machine that records the image in the transference, and how you could see that the analyst does so and kind of preserving for the subject the projections that they have, the fantasies that they have. Not the analysts themselves, like trying to record right now, but like in the way that the
Acting
sort
as
of,
a mirror.
yeah, the analyst and yeah is able to preserve that image on there in this misrecognition.
The image is just given back to them in its more skeletal form, in a sense, through the
Yeah,
transference and the sort of mirroring function
exactly.
of the analyst. If they're a good analyst, don't get too caught up in the counter transference.
Yeah.
Okay, that makes sense. You think it has anything to do with Heidegger's notion of consciousness being always conscious of something? Is that Heidegger? Or?
That's the Husserlian. That's the Brentano Husserlian. No, he's getting a rid of reflexivity.
Okay,
Yeah,
Heidegger is.
both Heidegger and Lacan, because that's on the notion of reflexivity. And even what is it? Sartre kind of critiques that too, in being and nothingness,
Why is that reflexivity?
because the be consciousness of something, the something can only be conscious itself, right? It's everything is structured by that. But then, like, well, what is consciousness then? Which begs the question.
I have a different question for you. Do
But
you
again, I'm not a phenomenologist, so I would be open for somebody to put in the comments about reflexivity and consciousness of something.
do you plump for the synapse as such?
Oh yeah, yeah, with the neuron and stuff, right? Yeah, this is definitely has to deal with the recording as
I just
well.
thought it was funny.
Yeah.
He plumps for the synapse as such.
Yeah, plumps.
It sounds vulgar.
Yeah.
You know? Stuff like that sounds more vulgar than when you're like trying to be vulgar for some reason,
Yeah.
to my mind. Um,
But then again, like another thing that I've realized too, and maybe we could tie this in with the homology of the dream. It's like in the commodity, there's a sort of recording machine or camera preservation. We record the sort of the formal structure of the commodity in which it resembles objet into our inner world when we go to sleep and dream. If we try to psychoanalyze Zizek's homology of the dream and the commodity, we could see that tying in, you know, because I think he's trying to use these. Who knows if Lacan what he's doing, if he's trying to metaphorize the camera machine or not, or if he thinks it's literal like D&G. But that's how I take it.
why does he bring up interpretation of dreams here?
Oh, in this one, well, interpretation of dreams will be brought up and so forth of trying to understand the sort of this
Well,
model.
the dream machine has a certain automaticity to it.
Yeah,
Just like,
yeah, it has an yeah, like right, an automatism to it with um deciphering the information and entropy within the psi model. Which I mean, in the next chapter we're gonna talk about the three schemas, psi, phi, and omega.
anything important here, or
No, everything else is pretty much going to be talked about. Like so, right there, I think like what you were just flipping through because this is on the last page or last second to last page, right? Of like pretty much he mentions the whole thing about what is it, psi, which has to deal with like the inner world, but everything is pretty much structured by consciousness. But he wants to talk about how like consciousness is a sort of structuring of phi, which represents the organism in relation to the stimulus that it gets from the outer world.
we'll talk about that a little bit also in play of writings,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Mm-hmm. And we're gonna talk about that. We're gonna talk about the what the play writings means. It has to do with scientific work, the dream work, and then beyond the pleasure principle. In between, we have the completion of narcissism, or the completion of the three sexual theories by narcissism.
And this we already talked about a little bit, but it's interesting because he brings up Kierkegaard again, ancient versus Kierkegaardian understanding of the structuration of the world, one that is through reminiscence. We talked about this in connection with Meno
Mm-hmm.
and the Platonic idea of all learning being merely a process of reminiscence, which is maieutic,
Yeah.
and then the structuration of the world through the effort of labor along the path of repetition. And this might be too fanciful a connection, but when I think about labor, I think of like labor power and sort of
Right.
similar process of like the repetition of work,
Right.
labor, the repetition of the reproduction of capital almost
Right. And
finds an analogy here in the
yeah,
construction of the world.
this is something that like Marcuse tried to do, and like he talked about how labor being something a part of the reality principle, and was sort of this like external stimuli that was put on the tension for pleasure. I just think it was a little too crude because when he talks about like, with that there leads to like surplus repression and alongside with surplus value. I just think it was just a little too crude because it's only on the level of like domination and repression and not on the like understanding of enjoyment and desire.
Yeah, I think we need to be careful with that. That's why I said it was kind of like a fanciful
Right.
connection that I was drawing there, but it's like just because you see a certain word that is conceptually cognate with another idea on the surface,
Mm-hmm.
seemingly so, then doesn't mean there's necessarily a relation. That's why
Mm-hmm.
it's like you have to distinguish between like homology and short circuit in this sense
Right. Yeah.
before you find these parallels between the logic of capital and the way the psyche works in a Freudian sense.
Yeah.
But anyway, I like what he said here. The human world isn't at all structurable as an umwelt fitting inside an innenwelt of needs. It isn't enclosed, but rather open to a crowd of extraordinarily varied neutral objects, of objects which no longer have anything to do with objects and their radical function as symbols. So it's kind of a neat idea he's working with here, which is that like, we have to structure our world to accommodate all sorts of symbols or
Right. Yeah.
signifiers, which I guess aren't exactly the same thing, but that have no real direct connection to anything we can quote unquote observe or
Yeah.
any referent that we can point to. Most of the time, we can't point to what the referent is. And yet our entire world revolves around mostly signifiers that don't have an immediate referent.
Yeah.
Even the ands and the ifs and all that. Should we take a quick break?
Yeah. The play of writings. Back at it again. All right. Was there anything that you wanted to cover on these first 2 pages?
I like this idea of madness not being dreaming.
Right.
It's not the same thing. It's like to be psychotic is not to just live in a dream.
Yeah. Because then they were trying to say that, like, I guess what like was being critiqued in Lacan, I forget, somebody named J.L. Lang that gave a discussion was trying to approach like psychosis in children, um, which is still like, I guess it's still debatable if there is such a thing like that. Well, at least during that time, if there is child psychosis, then what is psychosis in adults? But like, yeah, like, psychosis doesn't mean like they're like caught in a dream, and showing like, I guess this is what ties into the whole thing about like, dream, the whole dream work in Freud, and I guess what the dream is, versus like a hallucination or delirium in a psychotic person. Because there's some censorship, it seems like, and things that escape the dreams, right? Especially in dreams you forget.
Right. The psychotic doesn't operate along the lines of censorship.
Right. Because, I mean, and then also, obviously, there's foreclosure of the unconscious, or of the master signifier. So
What
there's no.
about what he says here about psychosis in children?
Right. That one was like a little like weird. I don't have enough knowledge on like the sort of clinical background of like child psychotics versus like, ordinary adult psychotics. But I guess that's something that's going to have to be put on the burner for later research.
I think this is where he really kicks it off. He says we always understand too much, especially in analysis, but most of the time we're fooling ourselves.
Right.
It's like you would think that analysis depends on being gifted, intuitive, putting to work your unique genius, but he's saying that isn't it at all. And in fact, what makes you unique, your supposed talents in this regard, need to be almost put aside.
Mhm.
It's not even a talent so much, not for what you can offer, but what you can, in a strange sense, withhold.
Right. Yeah. That's a good way to put it.
And there's a talent to that, but it's like you would think the problem with psychoanalysis is it attracts a lot of people who think, well, I'm intuitive, I'm good with people, I am empathetic, I want to help
Yeah.
people. Nothing wrong
Yeah.
with wanting to help people, of course, or being empathetic, but you have to, in a counterintuitive way, kind of leave behind all of those merits that
Right.
you might think define you as someone who's perfect candidate for being an analyst.
Right, because it really points out like, the whole like milieu of therapism and therapy culture, and that it's like the more empathetic and radically accepting that you are, the better that you can be for your patient. Radical acceptance, empathy, giving it, the skills to and tools to tackle life, right, and challenges to overcome depression. These workbooks that your therapist will give you, certain breathing techniques, cognitive abilities to sort of understand and cope with your triggers or automatic thoughts, you know fortune telling, as some of the slang terms are, like when you're overthinking, right? I forget the generic cognitive therapy. There's an actual term that they call it, when you start to overthink and like predict, circumstances that are going to happen. But it's like, overcoming that stuff. It's like right there, it's perfect for those people that have this like sort of saintly heart that believes, yeah, I'm empathetic, I'm good with people, I like to talk with people. And it's not that it's wrong, but analysis is not in the business of that. You have to withhold that, because it's perfect for an obsessional and hysteric that needs somebody to sort of, displace, you know this question of mastery on, or obsessional fantasies on. And those are the type of people that end up doing more harm than good to their patients, because they kind of don't see what's going on and why the transference is important.
Right. And it sort of relates back to what he was saying before about primary narcissism and the way that the specific coloration of your world emanates from your own image of your body. That is countertransference in the analytic dynamic, because you're only going to read into your patient's symptoms what pertains to your own libidinal economy, or affects that elicit another affect from you as the analyst, and understanding, being like, aha, I got it, wrapping it up, is to integrate it into your symbolic universe in some sense, to
Right.
successfully symbolize. And what we're not trying to do is successfully symbolize, but reveal the impasses of symbolization.
Right. Yeah, because to do so would be, like you said, countertransfer. It's like, oh, I know what's going on with this patient, and you already have an interpretation in your mind. You've already pretty much countertransferred and limited yourself, right? Even a brand new Lacanian that's like ready to like tackle their first session and sort of speak too soon. Oh, this is the neurotic right here. Just what I've learned, what I've read. No, don't get too excited.
And another thing we want to tell newly minted Lacanians is that there is no such thing as regression,
Yeah.
according to Lacan. When do
Right.
you see a grown man regress and start wailing, return to the state of an actual small child?
Right, because
I guess he doesn't quite say, he says it doesn't exist, but I guess he doesn't entirely
yeah,
deny it.
regression is something that I believe like is a concept that's like more uh used in like object relations and relational and other psychoanalysis after Freud, right? As in like what it says, like you kind of you go back to a sort of infantile state, you know.
Yeah, I just wonder why he brings it up here. It seems like it such a random tangent, but
Well, maybe because it's the fact of like the question of child psychosis and psychosis, and if like in the most like extreme cases of like whether it's like neurosis and even psychosis, if there's like this sort of presupposition of like, oh, they're regressing back to their infantile state of raw experience and like hallucinations and pure like libido or whatever the jargon they would use. I think that's kind of what he's trying to allude to. If I had to take a stab at it, that's what I'm thinking.
and he wants to tackle the question of like the play of writings in this sense by asking the question, why isn't a dream madness? And it seems like often Lacan is able to illustrate a point about neurosis through psychosis.
Right. And the main thing is like when you look at the interpretation of dreams, there's a sort of form and content of the working of the dream. And pretty much of trying to play about an unfulfilled wish and obtain a wish in the dream for Freud. So where would that be in madness? Right?
Good point. The psychotic doesn't really wish for anything.
Right, yeah.
So back to the interpretation of dreams, 3 essays, and beyond the pleasure principle, he wants to distill from these 4 texts or 3 texts, 4 schemata.
Right.
And it feels like a somewhat ostentatious way of leading to his main points. But
yeah, pretty much what he's trying to say is that there's a certain form of inquiry that was always there in Freud from the get-go with the scientific writings, and it's still there with this entire schemata of sci-fi and omega, that they still remain there even in beyond the pleasure principle. Just, you know, death drive just becomes the new kind of discovery.
can you define sci-fi and omega for us?
Yeah, so he's gonna break them down one by one throughout the entire chapter, but psi represents the internal. Well, let's start with phi. Phi represents the organism in relation to the external world, right? The external world full of energy that the organism processes this information that it gets, right? And then you have a stimuli with that. The stimuli is usually the external world. Then it internalizes it based upon the needs. That is the psi. We could talk about this as far as the internal structure of the organism or the sort of psychic, like somatic processes that come about, and managing needs with the sort of tension and entropy that it's dealing with within the in the umwelt, right? But what structures all this and what Lacan wants to get at is that there has to be another element in which Freud brings about, and it's consciousness, and then he'll later expand it with perception consciousness. But what it, and this would be the last one, omega, but it's not rather just like consciousness as like some like, substance or animism or anything like that. Rather, it's a sort of energy buffer zone that mediates the sort of tension and also structures the sort of umwelt that we could even have. We don't experience the umwelt or the outer world in phi as like the organism in the outer world. Rather, there is what we experience is the way consciousness structures with perception and other things, uh, the outer world, and how we process information, how we internalize it. Going back to seminar one, this is the whole thing about like when he says this is arbitrary relationship between the inner world and the outer world. It's the overall structuring of this by consciousness, right? That sort of not only allows us to interact but also differentiates. That's another thing too, is that there's this sort of differentiation that consciousness as its buffer zone allows us to pretty much handle this sort of entropy, because ultimately what's going about with this energy is a sort of trying to maintain homeostasis, being homeostatic, but we already know that's not a thing with the death drive.
Right.
We should see the ego as the sort of omega, as what he'll build up to. The buffer zone is resistance. It's frustrated. It can't do a lot with the energy, so it's going to displace it. This is where we get like things like repression, right? It's the energy the information that you can't handle. It goes somewhere, and this is what we'll see how it ties in with the interpretation of dreams, because all this excess energy gets lost into what he'll say right here, the navel of the dream.
Interesting.
Mm-hmm.
So that's where the excess energy ends up.
Mhm.
And then the navel of the dream is its symbolic corollary in some sense.
Well, it seems like what the navel of the dream represents is sort of like one's the core of one's being, as I think is said in a few other chapters prior to this, but something that we can't really access, with the symbolic, right? I think the navel of the dream is also synonymous to what the real would also be for Freud.
Is the navel of the dream, though, not that one element that feels like anomalous, that isn't perfectly assimilated into the action of the dream?
Right. Yeah.
So, in a sense, it is symbolized when you
I,
say.
I
That's what I
think
never understood about like Wolfman, where they're like, oh well, this was something he wasn't able to, the nail between in the hand evokes
right.
something he's not able to integrate into his own symbolic representation of reality, but at the same time he did represent it in a form, and it's a hallucination.
Exactly. So I think, in the sense, well, when we look at Seminar 11, I think, in a sense, when we talk about the navel of the dream and that, it's that the real always comes up in the encounter of it happens in the dream, in this repetition. Um, and he mentions this with like the whole thing of like, Father, can't you see I'm burning? And ties this in with like Fort Da, right? All that kind of like can't be integrated does get encountered at one point in the navel of the dream. And it's like a more of a traumatic process.
And that's when you wake up to keep
Mm-hmm.
dreaming.
Mm-hmm.
Is now I'm gonna just speculate on my own here without trying to stick to the letter of the text. Is it that in the dream, do we see this kind of what Jameson calls cognitive mapping at work, but in a more primitive manner,
Oh, that's a
in
good
a
question.
sense?
Yeah,
Because
because
it's
I mean,
like,
I've never read Jameson, but I know he's like kind of keen on that term cognitive
me
map.
neither, but like there's a kind of mapping that goes on, I feel like, with the
Yeah,
dreaming, and with like condensations, of course, it's like we don't have reality testing
yeah,
go off of. Reality itself, I guess, it's just like, again, displacements and equivalencies of energy that we're dealing with in consciousness, this
right.
excess. But there's no testing that goes on in the dream. There's the endless construction of images that blend into other images on the basis of like signifiers metonymically kind of trading places, I would say, which is sort of what goes on in the unconscious. That's not to say we're given a window into the unconscious. It is not the unconscious itself, but
Mm-hmm.
what is unconscious and what is alluded to in dream is in its formal properties, the way signifiers are combined in a sense. There we get the twist of the knife, so to speak, of the
Right,
unconscious, if that makes
right.
sense.
And how the subject will take itself into an account in those combinations.
Yes, exactly. And that isn't that what Lacan points out in Seminar 1. At one stage, he says that we have the representation of the body as something that is detached
Right.
from, well, is it detached from the subject in a sense,
Mm-hmm.
and we get the representation of that detachment,
Yeah.
whereas the immediacy of, let's say, signification as it's performed in our waking life means that we are immediately metaphorized. That's just another way of saying that the gap between the subject and the body in some sense is like collapsed.
Mhm.
and we experience ourselves as embodied
Right. Yeah.
immediately.
Oh, yeah. That's perfect.
Um, okay, so like he jumps ahead to the schema and reflexes.
Mm-hmm. Which are
He
five.
says that when Freud, when his theories became prominent, he was in many ways going against this tide of interpreting things in terms of reflexes.
Yeah.
And that might have something to do with this idea of equilibrium as a attainable state. Because if everything is like reflex, discharge, input and output, on the surface, it would seem like then that whole process can run smoothly.
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. But then you got other elements, which is the not only the needs and internalization, which is psi, but then you got omega. And I mean, these, if we're tying in these play of writings, then that which is sort of like would interrupt the process is going to be both omega because of its frustration and buffer zone in the repressive element that happens because it can't compute all of this stuff. And if there's a sort of like reality principle to the relation of phi, right, or phi, which is the relation of the organism with the outer world, with the external world, not outer, external world, right? It's always this balance towards this equilibrium, but also of obtaining pleasure at the same time, and managing the reality principle ultimately fails because of the excess that comes about, which is the death drive.
Because pleasure only comes from the discharge of excitation
Yes.
from the body. It
Mm-hmm.
isn't this like attainable state of, oh, here I am perfectly
Yeah, that's yeah,
situated in terms of what I want and need. And therefore, in what were we talking about the other day? Is it ataraxia?
yeah.
The
It's
state
just
of like,
really in Epicureanism.
I would say, serene harmony, a state of serene harmony with one's needs and what those needs demand and the
Right,
satisfaction of those needs in terms of like what's available and like a situatedness that is perfectly sufficient
right,
to the specific life form, the organism involved. And such a thing is a myth. It's a fantasy of, well, it's like a philosophical kind of fantasy if you think about it. It's a fantasy of like ancient philosophy in a sense,
right,
which is not unlike the kind of harmony that he's talking about, the pre-established harmony between the faculty and the object encountered. It's just another one of these myths of harmony, whereas what Freud discovered through the death drive and seeing the way it affected people in terms of their compulsion to repeat unpleasant memories, episodes of their lives, um, that it didn't entirely obey this logic of just reflex and discharge, and that it didn't serve them in any rational way, and that therefore, to create a better empirical model for the understanding of the subject and the subject's libidinal economy, the way that's managed, it's probably better to start with excess itself
yeah,
as the central fact of the human condition, in a sense, and then work backwards to the pleasure principle.
right, exactly. So it's like there's already this excess, and that's why the sense of trying to get pleasure is really just a discharge of the entropy and tension from the excess. But and if that's the case, like, well, there's also the reality principle, but it's never like this external world, like this, like, again, this harmonious nature that just like we just can't deal with. It's rather the sort of symbolic order that we're in relation with other people. And so it's like trying to discharge energy and also uh maintain order with others, not to cause conflict, not to you know break laws that are like that instantiate prohibition. And so what you can't discharge ends up becoming repressed, and then there's always a return to the repressed because of failed sublimation. And there's not, or you can't, if you can't sublimate it, you have to repress it, but there's not 100% repression, so it always returns.
So what about this idea of a buffer zone? What's the buffer zone? Is the ego the buffer zone?
Yes, that's the omega.
Okay,
And
omega
that's why
is
he's
the
trying to
ego.
say that is because it's not like the consciousness or omega is not like, again, this substance, but it's a buffer zone because it's acting as a sort of resistance of any excess, which would probably be the unconscious, but also it resists itself since it is always in a state of aggressivity or frustration.
That's interesting. Can you expand on that? The idea of the ego resisting itself?
Well, because the ego it's a set of resistances. It's not just under resistance. It itself is resistance because of the fact that it is in misrecognition. Uh, it's this constant anticipation of mirroring and also symbolic identification. And because of that, it has to buffer a lot of the information that it gets from the symbolic order, this like the world out there, and then also any internal tension and excitation from
Right.
side.
Right, because it needs to manage the repressed ideas, well, repressed formulations or formations, let's say, that
Mhm.
are constantly threatening to bubble to the surface, but then it's a very put upon agency, because then that which is filtered in also needs to be managed. So it's fighting a two front war, right,
Yeah,
against that which is repressed and that which comes from the outside.
yeah.
And it's what's interesting to me though is that it remains an image
Yeah.
also. So it's also, would you say it's also an organizing principle of one's symbolic universe? Does
Well,
that make
yeah,
sense?
yeah, yeah. Well, definitely, because it has to do with the series of identifications, and yeah, it's an image, and identifying with itself. So again, we go back to the seesaw of desire of ego ideal and ideal ego, right?
The series of identifications, though, these are the Bea Hong
Well,
identity.
no, Biao is affirmation that comes from the or like this revelation that comes from the sort of subject revealing itself, right? And the breakdown of empty speech. Um,
Okay, I didn't want to equate that with affirmation, but there's like
well, he
in
says
the
revelation in seminar one,
well, in
right?
like the primeval sort of period of the ego's construction, there's it's a series of affirmations and negations, essentially, but it's not the same thing as Bea Hong.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I
I
think.
don't know. I'm just trying to recall what we read in Verneinung chapter, but
But again, I think no. I think you're right to add Verneinung to this because that's what it's ultimately dealing with. This like series of like trying to affirm it and negate itself as a sort of center, but it's really a spectacle. It's a misrecognition.
trying to affirm this is what I'm trying to get at. In simpler terms, the idea of the subject who initially identifies with that which the subject takes to be a source of, well, what? Pleasure, safety, security. It's very vague if we keep it to like what's positive and happy and nice and agrees with the subject, and then whatever is bad is expelled in some sense. But it's difficult to rely on that very elementary distinction of like positive versus negative here. Do you know what I mean?
Think of it as like this: what the ego wants to do, as far as like when we talk about primary identification, is mastery, but mastery of one's body ultimately, and then that's where the narcissism comes in, and then the world is the extension of its enjoyment and its mastery, right? But it's never alone. The ego is never alone, but it's always the point of reference in which it could view the world and be seen by the world. And with that is always this sort of series of both imaginary and symbolic, anticipation. And this is why we, look at logical time, right? This anticipatory factor of the other's movement to deduce where I am and located, right? Because that also gives my sense of freedom and how I identify myself as a sort of true subject.
So to that end, I think it's interesting how he defines, the ego as something which is also self-negating, because the closer one gets to the ideational mass, right? We're throwing around a lot of terms here, but the closer one gets to, like, just say this bundle of identifications, the more those identifications seem to unravel.
Yeah, and it leads to anxiety. That's where we talk about when affects, the only true affect is anxiety that never lies.
Because we need to keep our own ego at bay. Would you say that the sort of like group identifications that come from different expressions of the ego ideal also, by subsuming yourself under the banner of a specific group, in a
Right.
sense that you are able to also keep yourself at a comfortable distance from your own individual ego and its resistances?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Because it's not only just the symbolic identification of like what that group stands for, right? Whether it's like, if we think politically, BLM, MAGA, or anything like that, but also the imaginary mirroring that you get from the phenomenological experience of said group and the sort of moods that it brings about. Ultimately the moods fail, the imaginary fails, but the symbolic, or not the imaginary fails, but like those moods come and go. And yet usually what keeps people gripped to that is a sort of symbolic identification for it and how it does relate. Because like there could be some like instances of like maybe this group breaks up, right? But yet what was the kind of signifier floating, and how did that relate to sort of building one's own individuality and kind of retroactively filling the void as a ideal ego, right?
Yeah. So
Because it's ultimately trying to get because it seems like what the ideal ego represents is not only a state of mastery of one's body, which is a misrecognition, right? It's illusory, but it's a sense of wholeness.
yep. Right. Right. That's why, to encounter, for lack of a better term, the real ego, and I don't mean capital R real, but the ego as a set of resistances, is anxiety producing, because the closer you get, the less wholeness there is to it. It's something that's very much not whole. It's something that's very threadbare. And
Yeah.
to that degree, it's like there's the ego proper is not the ideal ego. It's not the ego ideal. It's the series of resistances and identifications. It's a buffer zone. And you know what else that occurred to me. It's kind of funny because I was re-listening to part of our talk with Todd McGowan. We were talking about the phallus. Actually, something you said about the ego just reminded me of this. I'm not saying that they're completely related, but there's just a kind of like analogy that comes to mind here when he talks about, the guy who, there's the guy that points out that, what's the example with Stalin where the guy stands up
Right.
and says,
Yeah.
what
He
does he say?
exposes. Oh, well, I forget what he says, but he
He
exposes
he try,
Stalin.
right. So it's like the guy who tries to denounce Stalin, expose him in that moment. Like that guy, like let's say that person's willing to sacrifice his life in that moment just to denounce Stalin. But then he says the guy that stands up after that and says, "You can't say that."
Yeah.
He's also going to be put in a gulag or
Right.
executed, because it's like the one person is trying to expose that there's a veil,
Yeah.
and then the person who stands up to say, hey, you can't say that about the veil not being
Yeah.
there, is also bad because he's drawing attention in his own way to the fact that there is no, that the
Right.
veil is just a veil. And the reason that reminded me of what you said about the ego, because it's like the ego, like we said, has to fight this war on two fronts, but also needs to veil itself as that which it is not, in
Yeah.
order to remain undetected in a
Exactly.
sense.
Yeah. Yeah. No, that's exactly, that's the whole point of, I think, what Verneinung is, right? Because when you get close to the, you know, to the ideational mass, it's not like, that there's nothing there, but you also don't want to have to expose the veil that, covers the lack as well.
Which is what the nucleus of repression is
Yeah.
a void.
Yes.
That's dope. This idea of reality testing, hallucinations, I don't know if we want to add anything there. We get a nice little like retrospective on all of this schema we've been using up until this point, with our first appearance of my favorite schema. For Andrew stands the optical schema, but I stand schema L.
Schema L, yeah.
I love schema L. This is our first appearance of schema L, although he doesn't really get into it. The optical schema, some of you like it, others of you seeing this right now are getting PTSD. Talk about crisscrossing.
Yeah.
And this is from Freud, right?
Yeah, that's from the interpretation of dreams. And then I've never seen these schemas in here, or besides in here, but yeah, I guess they're like from the scientific writings. Uh, Stimuli in the external world. Um, and I haven't researched those, but it seems like the more dotted lines represent the sort of like relationship between the, external world and the sort of inner world. Like the dotted lines represent sort of like the virtual reality, or like the sort of inner reality and stimuli that happens from the path of being in the external world. Kind of like when you look at the optical schema, how you have these perforated lines as well. They represent sort of this like virtual point.
Yeah, actually, I don't know if we've ever commented on the fact that, yeah, you have these perforated lines and then the solid lines.
Yeah, which represents the light of the actual bouquet and everything in the vase that's at the box, and then it comes back in a sort of distorted virtual image for the eye, or for the ego.
Right. Becker talks about that, right? Where he says like the broken up lines have to do with the distortion, I think.
Right. Yes.
Right. So
Yeah.
it's like, yeah.
And then he talks about a sort of image that is lost, right? In there, like if the real image has to do with like the Das Ding.
Yeah. And then schema L,
Yeah, go
I
over
think
schema L a bit.
I can give it a shot. I mean, schema L, I feel like becomes a very important motif for Lacan, maybe throughout most of his career. And actually, that's when I was thinking about the broken up line here.
Mm-hmm.
You know, what we're trying to get at as analysts is the subject.
Mm-hmm.
And the subject is most poignantly in relation to the other. This is other capital O or the big other. So this is the symbolic order we've been talking about. Although I don't know if the big other has been formulated quite yet. The big other, I think, in distinction to the symbolic order, is that which adds approbation, um, its seal of approval on what is contained within the symbolic order in some sense. Now, then we have little a, the little other, and the little other is a counterpart to the ego. And the ego always stands in an imaginary relation with the little other. So this little other is pretty much any other ego you
Mm-hmm.
come into contact with throughout your life. Let's say, you initially imagine that your clinician, your analyst, occupies this space, which would just be similar to your accustomed mode of encountering another person.
Mm-hmm.
But I would say that the analyst needs to come to occupy this space, right, of the big
Yeah.
other and the symbolic order as a whole, because the unconscious communicates with the subject
Mm-hmm.
who exists beyond the ego, and where the ego breaks down, the subject emerges. But remember, this is the subject of language. This is an indeterminate subject. It's an
Right.
unplaceable, undecidable subject, which on the one hand makes language possible,
Mm-hmm.
but also represents the torsion of language, that the fissure we were talking about before within language. And that's what the unconscious is. I mean, the subject is in the unconscious, but the subject is also the unconscious. The subject
Right.
is what, on the one hand, makes the speech act possible, just like in everyday recountings of things that happen to us. We say, I did this and I saw this, and then this happened, and we have a point of reference here linguistically with the subject. But it's also that which is in many ways in excess of language, which language itself cannot situate, which the symbolic order cannot situate, and in that sense externalizes as its inassimilable
Right.
excess. The unconscious, though, as language, is, well, Zizek says it's somewhere between being and non-being. It
Yeah.
marks the place of a kind of where being meets up with non-being, which makes me think of what he says earlier, where actually the seams of the imaginary are connected with the seams of the real, in a sense. That's where you actually get the symbolic right there. But the unconscious is, as implied, I would say, by even the word itself, which is in the negative, its own failure. The failure of language itself, which expresses itself, to my mind, in the subject. So we need to bring the analysan to the point where the unconscious speaks them where they are spoken by the unconscious rather than what they demand of the other. Now, I don't know when it's this axis and this one, I'm not exactly sure what the connection is.
Right.
Um, but again, the broken up line here
Mhm.
also implies like distortion, because some of this does come through to the ego, of course, and this is right here is where the symptom would
Right.
emerge. So the ego is able to register sometimes what's going on here,
Uh-huh.
but only as a symptom. So
Oh,
I
yes,
hope
yeah,
that
yeah.
wasn't too
But yeah, and if there's this
long-winded.
imaginary relation of the body, that's how the symptom would show up as well. When we talked about in the last chapter of somatic symptoms, of like, especially like with where language fails to kind of speak about a symptom, it'll show up in a sort of like psychosomatic process.
Exactly. That I'm glad you related
Because
it back to that.
what
Yeah.
is the ego, right? But just the a bunch of a series of identifications, and the body is one of them. You know, primary narcissism is identification with the image of the body, not the body, but the image of the body. That's why there is no body. There's only an image of the body. And so it makes
Right.
perfect. That's what it makes perfect sense of the whole thing about like psychosomatic symptoms or neurotic. That's genius.
This part, yeah, right here is where the
Yeah,
psychos.
that was a good breakdown of the schema.
I need to figure out what's going on here exactly. Subject and little other.
Right. Yeah.
I'm not sure. Ego and big other. I mean, who knows? This could be how the ego thinks of the big other. We all have an idea of what the big
Right.
other is in our minds, but I don't want to complicate things too much.
Yeah.
Uh, I think we're coming to
We're coming close
the
to this
end here.
right here. Like the system of the omega, right there. He says is like made up of differentiated organs which do not register the massive energies coming from the external world. One could imagine energies massive change in the temperature, considerable pressures that they put into question the continued existence of the living organism. It's like right there is like what I was saying before in this like short little summary. It's like those processes of energy or information have to go somewhere. So, they end up going in sort of like this like repressive mechanism and become unconscious. They show up in maybe in dreams as well.
Well, so what Freud didn't have though is structural linguistics.
Right, right. So,
So he is speaking in terms of energy,
right.
and so is Lacan, only at this point to clarify Freud. But
Yeah,
eventually, I feel like, wouldn't you say like Lacan doesn't talk too much about energy, or does?
exactly. And it kind of makes sense when we talk about like it in a more linguistic fashion when we talk about like neurotic symptoms. It's like this excess energy, this excess need to speak more in a free association about a certain aspect of your life than you did like, oh, I didn't mean to say that, or why did I like, the slips of the tongue. It's like why am I
Oversharing, for
yeah,
example.
oversharing, yeah, yeah. Saying too much or saying too little or saying too much pretty much. But yeah, oversharing would be a good way of
I mean, not that that's a parapraxis or anything
right,
oversharing, but there's like it's kind of
right. The
something
source,
like a manifestation of that excess.
right. And when we talk about catharsis and cathexis, like in the session of like all that excess energy or excess speech that comes about in that, the sort of discharge and investment.
But I do want to emphasize though what he says here about like this common scale between inside, where the image depends on memory, and where it's hallucinatory, and then the outside.
This is on what page 110, right?
Right. So it's like in relation to reality testing, we
Mm-hmm.
already talked about this a little bit, but can we just briefly talk about that? Like
Yeah.
how the ego allows for reality testing, and
Mm-hmm.
then maybe how a hallucination of the kind that the Wolfman experienced could be a consequence of that reality testing malfunctioning.
Right. Yeah. Because I mean, if our reality, which is like us being in the world, right? It's structured by the buffer zone, right? And it'll get expanded on by Freud's model with perception consciousness. That omega buffer zone is perceptual as well. So that gives us a sort of gestalt way to play with reality, to test it in a sense, not to get Winnicott like playing in reality, but in a sense that's how we test ourselves. But in a sense, it fails with the sort of symptoms that Wolfman has, and in a way leads to this like hallucinatory, phantasmatic, way of being in reality, and sort of like his position is so obsessional that like he's never really, you know, not that anybody is really in reality, but the fact that he's so subsumed by a series of different fantasies that are fixated and obsessed that sort of he's being caught up in, I guess, the sort of psi or like inner world.
Oh, and it occurs to me that we haven't really talked about what the play of writings is exactly. Why does he call it that?
Well, he calls it the play of writings because it's like ultimately the um his way of reading Freud in a sort of like way of like, how like Althusser calls like, you have the early Marx and the mature Marx. It's like you have the early Freud and like the middle and late Freud, but you play it off. It's more of a way of to show that what was, in his early writings are still present in the later writings, and you have to play with these specific ones. He says at the beginning, it's scientific psychology, the dream work, um, the three essays of sexuality correlated with narcissism, and then beyond the pleasure principle.
Oh, right. Okay. Oh, that's why it is. That's why it's that. And then
And even though he's like expanding on his theories, we should see the sort of logic still kind of going along the side with understanding sci-fi and omega, or phi, psi, and omega.
and
Yeah,
the interplay between
yeah,
those three
and how the depth
locuses.
right kind of shows as a failure for a perfect harmonious system of the three.
And then we have like this comment here, which helps us to understand how this buffer zone structures reality by, in a sense, neutralizing reality. We want our reality to be as little threatening as possible, but in that process, we generate excess energy. We
Right.
must have used that word 100 times now, excessively. And we have to repress that, and then it comes back, right? We've already said that ad nauseum. But
Yeah.
what's interesting here is that he says that, that there are lines of force in the world in animal psychology, which we've talked about before. The lure for the animal in it, which is its own image, is different because it doesn't need to map itself
Yeah.
onto the world and construct the world that way. Whereas because of our maladaptation to the world, our inherent weakness at the level of the newly born formed fetus, we need to very laboriously and tediously construct a world for ourselves, but on the basis of this register, which is essentially misleading and ultimately inaccurate. That's not to say there is an accurate depiction of reality, but it's like that the register that we depend on to map reality, and that is the mapping of the body, two simultaneous processes, is very much skewed and informed by contingent realities, just episodic, historicized moments, which are utterly beyond our control, and we make do. But ultimately this leads to a misrecognition.
Yes. That was that. That was good. We're getting closer to the end now.
I think Andrew wants to wrap this up.
But we also got some dude named Chris that does get mentioned over
We
here.
got the homie Chris. Disappointing name. Sorry to all the Chris's out there, but it's just like, of course, he wasn't going to be remembered with that name. It's Chris with a K.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, but you need to be Lacan or Freud or
Yeah.
Hippolyte. It's like these are names people remember.
Yeah. We don't care about Vellabrega or Chris or
No, Vellabrega,
yeah.
that's a pretty sick name.
No, I
Not
mean
that he's not, but he's the exception that proves the rule. Chris, on
right.
the other hand, merely Chris.
Yeah.
Um, so consciousness is sort of nothing in a sense.
Right. Yeah.
I think if I get what he's doing correctly, it's kind of like saying we can sort of dispense with consciousness because it's totally dependent on what it. Well, no, I don't want to reduce it to the Husserlian thing though either, but it's totally dependent on the symbolic order.
Right. It's dependent on the phenomenon as well, like the phenomenon or the symbolic order that structures it, right? In a sense, for the for the subject, consciousness or the ego, this buffer zone is what structures, this umwelt for the inwelt.
What would Lacan say to the old cliched sort of koan of if a tree falls in the forest, does it make a sound?
That's a good question. What do you say?
I would say no.
Yeah, like
I don't think it unless there's a camera there.
right. Which I mean, with that, like was like the recording of consciousness shows that phenomenon, a materialized definition of consciousness.
How can we make sure that we prevent everything we're talking about from being misconstrued as just another support for the whole universe contemplating itself kind of thing? There's only
Right.
one
Yeah.
consciousness and it's a it's a collective consciousness, and individual subjectivities are merely just sort of like fractal
Yeah.
singularities that are just expressions of this massive great consciousness.
Right. Well, the thing is that consciousness or the ego is something that's displaced by the Freudian experience, right? With because of the death drive, that that type of thing centers consciousness around the entire model of the world, and what Freud's Copernican revolution does is displaces consciousness.
Displaces consciousness by revealing
Yeah.
another system of relations.
Exactly. Yeah, system of relations that's just like kind of keeps any sort of totalized harmony, or like what the Enlightenment project was trying to do, right? Create like a secular order, right, by privileging man's reason and scientific wit and curiosity for discovery.
And if we locate thinking in scare quotes in the unconscious,
Mhm.
in many ways we can do away with consciousness altogether as a problem.
Right. Yeah. Because you could see science trying to privilege consciousness in some way and try to locate it in the brain, like what I talked about earlier about neuromania. They're still trying to use these terms, like even though like they're ultimately a problem for philosophy, they've become situated as a problem for science, but still in the same errors that philosophy has shown. And this is why like someone like not only Freud was on top of it, but then like you look at Hegel, and you look at like psychoanalysis with like Lacan and the sort of structuralist and post-structuralist dimension of sort of always decentering consciousness. I mean, the post-structuralists wanted to rather get rid of it, but and make it like historically contingent. But when you get someone like Zizek and Zupančič in the Ljubljana school, it's sort of like this ontological lack and split. It's with the help of psychoanalysis and the Hegelian dialectic.
Well, more important for psychoanalysis is the subject, the ego, and the unconscious. And the triad of those form something like consciousness, but not the consciousness that philosophy grapples with.
Right.
That's why I think he says
Like,
he
yeah,
cuts the Gordian knot, because it's kind of
exactly.
like we can't even approach it as
Yeah.
something that needs to be explained.
Yeah.
It doesn't even require an explanation in a sense.
Mhm.
What does is the nature of the ego and all that.
Yeah.
All right. Learn how to let your thoughts dwell on these thankless moments, Andrew. This is actually a nice little kind of like fortune cookie
Yeah.
statement he leaves us with. Learn how to let your thoughts dwell on these thankless moments, and don't forget that these are the first moments of a creative thought whose development carries us far beyond. I like that. He's saying sometimes, like when you're really in the midst of trying to work through ideas and you're like totally lost, that's the best. That's the spot right there. That's the sweet spot. When you're banging your head against the wall, that's when you're on the verge of something good. That's what I got from that. So don't say Lacan never gives advice.
Yeah, he does.
Okay,
Good.
that was a good episode, I think. I mean, all of our episodes are good.
That was a tough one,
We're
but
good at what we do. I mean, that's all thanks. It's Andrew, let's be honest. I couldn't swing it on my own, but it's
I
nice
couldn't
to
do it on my own either.
editorialize.
That was a good one though.
If Andrew's the record, I'm the one scratching.
The scratch. We gotta thank Lacan, Valabrega, and all the other hysterics in there, Hippolyte for doing the reading.
Right? It's like an album jacket, the book, all thank yous. We want to thank Valabrega, Khan, Raekwon. Shout out to Chris. He died too young.
Leclerc for taking all those shots.
Shout out to Leclerc for coming up with the rhyme schemes that we use to this day.
Their idolater's delight, pretty much.
Shout out to all the little idolaters there. Idolater is gonna idolize.
Yep.
That's how it is. And if you don't want to be a little idolater, then subscribe to our channel, watch our videos,
Right.
and you'll de-entify all the entities
Exactly.
you thought were God-given.
Yeah, you'll learn how to not make an engraven image.
Yep. All right. Peace, y'all.